Hello, vinyl community. So, right around 1972, 1973, kind of the ultimate proto-punk band of all times, the Stooges, Detroit Stooges, were beginning to, the wheels were starting to come off the cart by the time they hit 72, 73. We would still get some pretty good music at that point, but things were starting to slowly come unwound, and the commercial realities of our economic system would eventually catch up to the band. But fear not, because there was another band waiting in the wings from New York City in 1972, formed in 72, and that was the Dictators. And the Dictators would pick up the mantle of I think the Stooges in a way not too many other bands were able to do. It wouldn't be shortly thereafter that we would start to hear punk and we would start to hear that grow into its own. But imagine the feeling in 72 of creating music like that, and with very, very little commercial success, and yet continuing to labor on. And yet that's what the Dictators did. So the Dictators released their first album, which was today iconic cover. Hold on, I should take it out of here. Great album, fun. I think that's one area where the Stooges kind of always took a really serious role. The Dictators injected a larger amount of humor into their music, and weren't afraid to rock out, and at the same time also have some laughs while they were doing it. The band has an interesting connection to a metal band called Manowar, which I think is in many ways perfect, because I think this distinction between metal and punk has just gone too far. Although there's some, they kind of took two different philosophical routes, so to speak, and came to different conclusions. But there's too many examples of bands like the Motorhead, and even you can look at bands like Megadeth, even, and to a certain degree Metallica, maybe to a lesser degree. But the connection between the two, creating aggressive kind of I'll use the term kind of male-orientated music. Often on the punk side of things, it had more of a political bend, which is perhaps maybe one of the reasons that punk was not as successful in the States as it was, say, in England and in Europe, because Americans tend to have a certain we tend to push back on anything that's at all political, and we get nervous about those things, because we don't like hearing about things that don't fit the American narrative. And so here we have the Dictators, and forming. This album came out in 75. It's a great record, and highly recommended. But what's so interesting about this band is that this album got a fair amount of promotion. And even as a pretty young boy, I used to read Cream magazine, and you'd read a fair amount about the Dictators, and it's what I remember seeing this ads for this album in music magazines back then. I loved the cover. It was immediately appealing, and the songs are all about partying and driving fast and girls, and there's a lot of all of this has to be taken with a certain amount of humor. There's also a nice injection of maybe surf rock injected into this too. Pictures of the guys back there. But what's interesting is, as good as this record was, and as iconic as that cover ultimately became, I always can't help but to think that this is a great record. But the band would go on to I think break up shortly after, not shortly after, but after some touring and doing some things. It wasn't working out for the band in a commercial sense, and so they decided to go ahead and pursue other opportunities that they had. Ultimately, coming back together with a slightly different configuration for this album, which is this was in '77, and this album is, if that album was good, this album was great. This album had stripped away a little bit of the humor, and which probably the record company people were saying was off-putting to some of the people who wanted to take punk in a more serious direction. The humor's still here. Songs like Young, Fast, and Scientific. It's full of the same great Stooges influenced rock and roll. In fact, they do Search and Destroy, and there's a great clip on YouTube you can find of a live performance of it that has to be seen. In fact, these guys lack nothing in aggression on what the Stooges were doing, even if they did lack Iggy himself. But this was a better album than the first one. Unfortunately, for the realities of things, the template had in some ways already been set, and fans and record company executives had already typecast the Dictators from the first record, and I think this album was very, very overlooked as a result of it. In fact, this was one of those records that I can remember always being able to find in the cutout bins when my mom would go to Woolworths shopping for whatever she was shopping for, soaps or whatever. They had a small, very small record section that I immediately always headed to, and you could always count on seeing these Dictator albums in that bin, along with like some of the later period Black Sabbath records, and there was always a few, Robin Trower records mixed in there. But it was a great way at a young age, for 99 cents to pick up an album. They would usually have the corner. This one doesn't have the corner cut off of it, but a lot of times they would have the corner clipped, and which meant that they could sell it at a discount. And so that was always a lot of fun to go through that bin. And that was back in the days when you could find some of those albums that I pulled out of that 99 cents bin at Woolworths are still in my record collection today, and became, in fact, I'd say a good percentage of my records have a clip off the side or a drill hole through them. Never bothered me, and it didn't affect the music at all. So the band would go on to do this album, and it would be ignored. It wouldn't get any traction, and Manifest Destiny. Nevertheless, seek this album out. You want to hear some Stooges era punch that continued on into the mid and late 1970s. The band had one more chance to give it a go, and they took full advantage of it and released their third album almost out of a sense of just, we're not going to give up, and released an album, Blood Brothers. Now in this one you can see that little mark right there. That would be a cutout mark, and that's where they would always find those drill holes, and that's the same album that I picked up back in the day. Blood Brothers would be as good as this album is, and it is good. It's not quite as good as Manifest Destiny, but these first two, the second and third Dictator albums, a lot of people have talked about, historically, if these albums had come first, if Manifest Destiny, and then as a second album, Blood Brothers, which have great covers and great titles of songs. In fact, they do Slow Death by Flaming Groovies. If these had come first, history could have been significantly different than it turned out. That's not the way things worked out, and what we're left with is three, I think, classic proto-punk albums from an era that captured the rage of the streets in New York City the same way Iggy and the Stooges were able to capture the economic decline of Detroit in the early 70s. So you don't hear Dictators get talked about too much, or if I do, I don't hear them talked about in kind of a serious manner. But these albums are still amazingly inexpensive, and people who are seeking out and importing bands, great bands I'm sure, but bands from around the world, and paying top dollar for things, in the American bins, I'm sure you can still find these. I run across them on a fairly regular basis, and these are not to be missed. So if you're from the States, you can get them cheap, and my guess is if you're from other parts of the world, if you go on Discogs, I bet anything these are still $10 and $20 records tops, and that these are sitting in a lot of bins, not being played, not being used, and that's a shame, because these are really great records that if you are inclined at all towards the Stooges or the MC5 or the New York Dolls or the Heartbreakers, if you're inclined towards any of that New York scene, these albums are worth grabbing. One more item that I just wanted to mention. I mentioned it in another video, but I didn't have the book ready. So this is a great book about the rise of the Sex Pistols. It's one of my favorite music books that there is. And I've read this so many times, you can tell the pages are starting to get a little warped, and the back cover is a little, it's gotten its use. One of the most useful aspects of this, though, that to me, back when I started reading this, was that in the back of it is a discography on punk in the broadest sense. And it doesn't just give you a discography of the British punk scene, but goes extensively into the Australian scene and the US scene, and even going into areas like listing Kraftwerk and Brian Eno and albums like that would splinter off from the original idea of punk, but taking it in in a whole new direction. Perubu, all those type of bands, Wire, are in here, and it's a great way if you're not real familiar with that scene, punk and then the post-punk stuff, to have it all in one nice tight little place. And I used to just go through this, and even when I didn't know what the band sounded like, I would just search those albums out and get them home, and without a doubt they would always be fantastic. So anyway, 3 Dictator albums, England's Dreaming, and hope everyone has a good day. Thanks.